So, I hope you all had a good lunch. This is the second part of today's plenary session with the title of The Country of Origin Principle for Audiovisual Media Services. As I mentioned, and it was mentioned several times this morning, the European Commission's Green Paper, published in 2013, asked many relevant questions, and one of these was, what would be the impact of a change of the audiovisual regulatory approach on the country of origin principle and therefore on the single market? Further emphasis on this aspect was given in 2014 under the Italian Presidency, when the Council adopted conclusions urging the Commission to assess the functioning of the country of origin principle in the audiovisual landscape. And the need for such an assessment, as we time and time again heard this morning, has been further highlighted by the current geopolitical situation in Europe. Now, the preamble to the directive states clearly that the country of origin principle should be regarded as the core of the directive, as it is essential for the creation of an internal market. Now, put simply, it means that each provider of audiovisual media services comes under the jurisdiction of one and only one EU member state for the purposes of the directive. As we know, the intention is to ensure the free flow of information and audiovisual programs in the internal market and the legal certainty needed for service providers to be able to develop new business models for cross-border services. Does the principle work in practice? What can go wrong in its implementation? Are the current jurisdiction rules up to the job? What about the cooperation procedure in times of emergency? Looking at these and other aspects of the country of origin principle will be our three expert panelists. Ross Biggam is Director General of the Association of Commercial Television. After studying law at Exeter and Saarbrücken, Ross worked as legal advisor to the House of Lords EU Select Committee before joining ITV, the leading television channel in the UK, where he ended up as head of European Affairs. In 2000, he moved to Brussels to become Director General of the Association of Commercial Television in Europe, which represents the interests of the commercial broadcasting sector in Europe. The ACT has 33 member companies licensed in 30 different European countries and distributed across 45 European markets and beyond. ACT members operate several hundred free-to-air and pay TV channels and distribute many more channels and news services. The ACT members encompass several business models: free-to-air broadcasters and pay TV players, digital platform operators, as well as multimedia groups. Our second panelist is Henrik Toremark, who is Group Head of Public Affairs at MTG, the Modern Times Group. MTG is an international broadcaster and entertainment group. The operations of MTG include TV channels and platforms, online services, content production, and radio stations. Henrik has a background in politics, communication, and PR. Before taking up his present position, he was Deputy State Secretary in the Swedish Minister for Culture, and he has also been a political advisor in the Swedish Ministry of Finance and in the European Parliament. For a number of years, Henrik worked as a senior consultant in public relations and public affairs. Our third panelist is Egils Levits. Egils graduated in law and political science from the University of Hamburg. He was advisor to the Latvian Parliament on questions of international law, constitutional law, and legislative reform. He's a former ambassador of the Republic of Latvia to Germany and Switzerland, Austria, and Hungary. He was Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Justice, an acting Minister for Foreign Affairs, a conciliator at the Court of Conciliation and Arbitration within the OSCE. He was a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. He was elected judge at the European Court of Human Rights in 1995 and re-elected in 1998 and 2001. He has numerous publications in the spheres of constitutional and administrative law, law reform, and European community law. He has been a judge at the European Court of Justice since the 11th of May 2004. Last year, Egils Levits gave a lecture at the Riga Graduate School of Law with the title Sovereignty of the Member States of the European Union, which is a topic of great relevance for this session. So, please, Ross, Henrik and Egils, could I invite you to the platform? So, to kick off this session, the floor is with Ross Biggam.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I thought you've already had a long introduction to the ACT, so I'll keep this very brief. These are our member companies. As you heard, they represent a range of business models: pay, free, international and national broadcasting. The one thing which they all have in common is that we are entirely private sector, so independent from government or state control. I'm going to start by trying to say something in Latvian, or at least writing something in Latvian. This, I think, is how to say thank you in your language. Not just thank you for the invitation to be here, which I hope is taken as granted, but also thank you for the work you've done in the first 10 weeks of your presidency. The Latvian presidency was 1 week old when you had the murders in Charlie Hebdo, already referenced this morning. And in a very short period of time, you had a very clear statement got through the Council of Ministers, which didn't just condemn the killings, but also spoke of the importance of free media, freedom of expression. We thank you for that. Also, your foreign minister was in Brussels last month. We made a very eloquent speech about the importance of free media, free debate. And I understand you're planning something on 3rd of May around World Press Freedom Day in Riga and in Brussels, which again is an opportunity we applaud. And just to embarrass our moderator, Latvia also worked hard at the Council of Europe to get a text agreed about media freedom post-Charlie Hebdo, although they couldn't get unanimity due to the opposition of a bordering large member state. But it was a noble effort, and certainly I think I can speak on behalf of other bits of the content sector as well, public broadcasters, newspapers, etc. We're all very grateful for this level of support from the Latvian presidency. That observation leads me indirectly into the subject we're talking about today, because freedom of expression clearly is not absolute. There's no absolute freedom of expression anywhere, and certainly in European broadcasting we have a rather constrained freedom of speech. Our equivalent of the First Amendment to the US Constitution, Article 10 of the European Convention, is of course full of exceptions and get-outs, licensing of TV, duties, responsibilities, formalities, conditions, etc. And there are restrictions in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive around hate speech. So really, I guess the question boils down to how far can a state restrict speech which it finds distasteful or unpleasant? And if the state wishes to do so, how does it go about it? To come to the specific programme of today, your programme states that the country of origin principle represents the core of AVMS. Andris has just repeated it, but then goes on to speak about the issue of non-EU channels registered somewhere in the EU, targeting the audiences of other member states with content deemed unacceptable by the receiving state. And that was very eloquently spelled out, particularly by the first three speakers this morning, what the consequences are and the seriousness with which it's viewed in this market. And I think also in your neighbouring countries. I think one speaks about Latvia, but I think also your Baltic neighbours have similar issues. I was asked to give the ACT's view about country of origin, and if anything, we'd go perhaps rather further than say that the principle represents the core of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. To us, country of origin is the entire raison d'etre of the AVMS Directive. That directive contains quite extensive harmonisation of broadcasters' daily operational practices around scheduling of advertising, programme quotas and other things. And this is a kind of implicit trade-off that as broadcasters we accept that level of minimum harmonisation in exchange for the freedom, should we so wish, to distribute our signals also into other European territories. I think if the country of origin principle were ever to be removed wholesale from the directive, not that that's on the agenda, that would call into question whether we actually need to have an AVMS directive at all, if we're effectively renationalising broadcasting policy to that extent. Nor should we forget that the country of origin is not just in the AVMS directive. In fact, it was already in the Council of Europe Convention, which was adopted a few months before the directive. And this is relevant not only because it shows how widespread the principle is, but also because it takes us into some interesting markets. Among the countries which have ratified the Council of Europe Convention, but which have at best an ambivalent attitude to content coming from overseas, are significant markets like Turkey and Ukraine. So if we can have the country of origin rule, doesn't just serve the purposes of international media business groups, although it serves those rather well, it also serves freedom of expression, getting different viewpoints into some difficult markets or run by governments that aren't necessarily receptive to content coming in from overseas. Logically, therefore, as commercial broadcasters, we take a rather sceptical view of calls for moves towards country of destination control by certain member states. Over the 25 years of the directive, there have been many calls for various issues to be subject to greater country of destination control. And although these are always dressed up in fine-sounding principles about consumer protection, we suspect there's often an element of protecting the local public broadcaster or protecting the local advertising market lurking behind these principles. I would, however, make quite clear, I hope, that I believe Latvia and the Baltic states are exceptions from this rule. Anyone who listened to the speeches this morning can be in no doubt that the opposition you have to channels coming in from overseas is very sincerely felt, and clearly it does go to the heart of your identity as a state. So, unusually perhaps, we're in a situation where I think there is a legitimate interest being raised by a country of destination which we have to discuss. Your paper then goes on to talk about whether an argument can be made for country of destination in certain very specific cases. And I think overall our approach to this is we accept the seriousness of the problem you have. We accept it must be profoundly unpleasant and destabilising to have this form of content being transmitted into your market. But where we would part company with you is whether the AVMS directive, and specifically the country of origin rules, are the way to help fix it. If you were to talk about country of destination in certain very specific cases, clearly there's an immediate question would arise in our minds as broadcasters. Who will define those cases? Will there be safeguards for us as operators, or will the decisions be taken rather at an intergovernmental level? How do we interpret the case for existing services which are legally licensed somewhere else in the European Union and therefore have carriage agreements with platforms based on those broadcasting licenses? So I understand what's motivating the argument, but we do think it's going to cause serious problems. And bear in mind that, as Maya Capello showed earlier, there are about 1,500 broadcasting services which have exploited the freedom of the TVWF and then AVMS directives to broadcast from one member state into another. So you've got 1,500 legitimate services which are contributing to media pluralism, investing in local content, and they are being potentially jeopardized by perhaps half a dozen channels, which are causing admittedly serious problems in 2 or 3 markets. Another issue that's been floated around a bit this morning is the question about whether editorial responsibility in future could be shared between the broadcasters, where it currently lies, and the platform operators. Again, a concern here would be that we might end up trying to fix a very specific problem by rearranging the wider architecture of the directive. It was clear from the previous panel that this discussion about who is editorially responsible for content goes to the heart of the whole two-tier system of the AVMS directive. And the responsibility which currently sits on broadcasters is one that we are happy to take on and to acknowledge. We are proud of the fact that we are responsible for everything that appears on our screens, be it advertising, programme content, and we don't seek to hide behind a kind of legal interpretation about that. And currently, there's a nice clear rule that the editorial responsibility sits with the broadcasters. There may be a case for looking at some borderline cases where platforms are becoming editorially active, but for the moment, we think it would be a mistake to reopen that point in the directive purely with the Baltic states case in mind. I was also asked a specific question about whether there is noticeable evidence of jurisdiction shopping within the current system. Look, certainly, as far as the companies who I represent are concerned, the answer is no. All bar 1 or 2 of our member companies are quoted on stock markets. These are fairly big operations, and they're not going to move from one country to another for the sake of getting an extra 30 seconds advertising. It's significant, perhaps, that, as far as I'm aware, there's been no successful case brought against circumvention in the 8 years of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. And also, again, to refer to Maya Capello's slides from earlier, it's significant that the 3 jurisdictions which have the most linear TV services based in their markets but going elsewhere in the European Union are the UK, France and Sweden. 3 very different markets, but 3 markets which don't have a reputation for being regulatory light touch, put it that way. And certainly if the UK is the market leader in licensing transfrontier broadcasters, if you look at the rules which Ofcom applies to its licensees, Ofcom applies significantly stricter rules than the European Directive on advertising minutage, on HFSS food, on alcohol advertising, and particularly on the local speciality, which is access services for the deaf and hard of hearing. So there are many reasons why you might choose to locate an international media business in London, but I can assure you that an easy regulatory life is not one of them. So far, I hope I've managed to express a degree of both personal sympathy, but also sympathy on behalf of the sector for what you're experiencing in your countries at the moment. But we're a little sceptical that fixing the AVMS directive is necessarily the way to do it, apart from anything else because of the timelines involved. In the event that you persuade the Commission to go back from Riga and to start revising the directive to fix this problem, it will be, at best, another 12 months before we see a text, then 2 years of negotiation between Member States and Parliament, and then probably some time left to implement the new text. So you're looking at a solution which would be in place in maybe 4 or 5 years' time, at best, by which stage you would hope the geopolitical situation has moved on. And our concern, frankly, is you could find text that would fix your problem, but that in 5 years' time, it would be misapplied by another government somewhere else in the European Union to target some of those legitimate services which are currently broadcasting on licenses from one member state into another. Because I don't want to just make negative comments all afternoon, I've thought of a couple of ideas where we think we could try and help, short of reopening the AVMS directive. Firstly, it seems clear from what was said this morning that there is a market failure in providing objective, ethical journalism in the Russian language in these territories. I'm aware of, from press reports, that you are considering, both in Latvia and your neighbouring countries, asking your local public service broadcaster to do more news provision in Russian. Now, when you come to these conferences, you hear a lot of things about the wonders of public service broadcasting, but one of the main arguments in favour of public broadcasting has always been that it serves all the population. So this seems to me to be a logical completion of the public service remit in these member states, and certainly if you want to get more good quality information to those Russian speakers in your territories, it's something that whether you do it via the public broadcaster or a tender for a commercial news provider, is something that we would support. And that is quite a fundamental point, really. If we believe that good journalism, that ethical, objective journalism will be better than propaganda, then in the medium term, you will have better services provided to your local Russian speakers. And if we don't believe that good journalism will defeat propaganda, then that raises a wider issue about what we think of the future of the European sector. The second thing we'd like to discuss with you offline is whether we need to have a rethink about what is meant by hate speech. Until a few years ago, I would have said that hate speech is one of those things that we don't need to define because you know it when you see it. And to an extent, that's still true. Every newsroom around Europe has these jihadi Islamic State videos sent to them, and it's a fairly obvious decision you don't broadcast those. That's sort of classical hate speech, which is fairly easy to define and to act against. But it seems to me that what you've been experiencing in these markets, and I don't have the linguistic or political skills to comment in detail, but it does seem to me that you're experiencing some profoundly offensive and challenging content, but which is falling just short of the definition of hate speech. And we would be happy, not just ourselves, but I imagine that other broadcasters and other journalists group would want to be involved in this. We'd be happy to discuss with regulators, maybe Ergo's the place to do it, maybe somewhere else, about whether we need to update and have some kind of interpretive communication about what could constitute hate speech. It seems to me we have a protection there against incitement to hatred, which isn't quite doing the job it was meant to do. And maybe that's an area we should work on rather than trying to reverse the rules on jurisdiction. Just to repeat my final comment then, we share your objective here. We believe that the optimum is that all your citizens, whether they're Latvian speakers or Russian speakers, have a range of news sources to choose from, whether it's online, on broadcasts or in print. Where we part company, rather, is that jurisdiction and the AVMS rule is the way to solve this. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ross. I must take issue with you on one point, in that we don't part company. The official Latvian policy is country of origin remains. But it's how we define the jurisdiction rules that is under question. But I'm going to be an honest broker here and not express an opinion. Henrik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for being invited here. I would like to express my gratitude to the Latvian Presidency for organizing this conference and also for the initiatives you have taken during the Presidency. I will address some of the issues regarding freedom of expression, country of origin, etc., and what we as an operator can do to promote plurality and diversity on the European market. I would, of course, also address some of the challenges that we are facing in Latvia and the other Baltic states. Before doing so, however, I would like to give you a very brief presentation on who we are and what we do. So, back in 1987, almost 30 years ago, TV3 started the first commercial channel to challenge the Swedish and Scandinavian public service monopoly. At the time, we only had 2 channels. Today, it sounds really weird, but at that time, it was really controversial. And in my office room, I have some headlines from the time and how authorities tried to stop TV3. But it didn't succeed. Personally, I mostly remember that on that year, we doubled the number of hours of Disney, because it was at that time only 1 hour on Christmas, and we started on New Year's Eve. So, and then broadcasted more Disney. So that was what I remember from that time. But from that on, we have continued, MTG has continued to innovate and expand. Free TV, pay TV, and a platform for third-party channels, new services, new market, content production, and of course, in recent years, the digital development. So today, we reach more than 100 million people in almost 40 countries, and very much so thanks to the AVMS directive, I must say. We are strong, particularly in entertainment and sports. You probably wonder why I have this, the skiers here, but that is that we are very proud that we, for the first time, managed to acquire the sports right for the Olympic Games, both winter and summer. And we reached more audience than ever before in the last Winter Olympics. Another way of describing MTG is to sort of 3 pillars for expansion. Going to new markets geographically. We invest a lot in content. We deliver not only to our own channels, but to other TV channels. And of course, we are investing a lot in digital developments. So we have then, if we just look at sort of our business segments, we have the sort of where it all started, free TV Scandinavia, and then we have a lot of pay TV services in the Nordics and in emerging markets, and then of course, which is particularly interesting for the Baltics, that we have grown in free TV in emerging markets. For those who are from Sweden who are here, they should perhaps specifically know that in the Baltics we have news and views, and we are an important sort of player in the media landscape in the Baltic states. And here you have a summary of some of the services, the TV3, the Viasat, and then of course we are a carrier of third-party channels as a platform. Some numbers: we have a long-term investment and commitment, more than 300 employees. We invest a lot in our own production, and we have local content, news and views in Estonian, in Latvian, and of course also in Russian. And some 15 million euro is invested sort of in the 3 countries. There, I think I leave the slides, and as I said, we are an international broadcaster and entertainment group. Both our employees and our customers and viewers come from and represent different backgrounds, cultures, opinions, and standpoints. Because of this, freedom of expression, freedom of choice for our consumers, and there are important pillars upon which this company is built. Throughout our almost 30 years of history, we have opened new markets, offered consumers new platforms and services. Of course, we are very humble, but we are proud that we have played a little part in the extension of freedom of expression and diversity throughout these years. And we will continue doing so by expanding to new markets, using traditional and new services. In view of these experiences, where we have been sort of a challenger in our home market and then expanded and created more diversity, we have resisted unjust or discriminatory restrictions on the freedom of expression and freedom of choice. As a provider of content and distributor of third-party channels owned and operated by others, we value and encourage plurality. And we want to make sure that the viewers can make their own decisions on what programs and content they would like to receive. Of course, and this is a bit of the issue here today, we acknowledge that in limited and serious circumstances, like incitement for hatred, protections of minors, freedom of expression can be curtailed. However, as recent events in Paris and Copenhagen has shown, it is essential to stand up for freedom of expression, also when it's controversial and distasteful to some groups. Therefore, any restrictions should only be imposed in accordance with the appropriate legal procedures and EU law. I believe that Ross has already outlined the fundamental values and principles upon which the AVMS directive and its predecessors has been founded. And I believe that the country of origin principle is at the very heart of the AVMS directive, and it has, as I said before, been an important factor for MTG to be able to expand, to invest in content, to reach new markets, and thereby creating jobs. We have 4,000 about in MTG. Before coming to the specific concerns of the Baltic states, we can just consider for a moment what would have happened if we hadn't had the country of origin principle. I will certainly not comment on political developments in individual member states, but we know in recent years there has been a lot of debates in some of them, and I could easily foresee that we would have had a lot of unjust and discriminatory restrictions in the freedom of expressions if we hadn't had this principle. Having said this, we are very well aware about the concerns and worries regarding the Russian channels in the Baltic states, primarily in Latvia and Lithuania. If you allow me to make a few personal remarks, the Baltic states are at my heart, their independence. I was here first time in January 91, then in Estonia, and later also in Latvia, Lithuania. And I was also very active in the so-called Monday movement to support Baltic independence. So, just as a remark. And it was fantastic to celebrate the independence after the failed coup in Moscow in September 91. Later, it was, of course, a very important milestone in 2004 when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania became members of the European Union. And I know that much more so than in many other countries, European integration, common values and rules have been regarded as a cornerstone for protecting that freedom and independence. So we very much understand and respect the concerns and worries that have been raised the past year. We know that thanks to our long-term commitment to the market and investments, and not least thanks to all our fantastic colleagues and employees working in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Therefore, MTG has all along tried to encourage dialogue and cooperation between national regulators and the European Union. We have been in constant dialogue with Ofcom and also with the Swedish Broadcasting Agency. In this context, I would like to underline, I think Ross mentioned this a little bit, that, for example, Ofcom has a very transparent procedure for complaints, and they never hesitate to tackle issues regarding tricky content. This can be illustrated by the fact that Russia Today, the English-speaking Russian channel, repeatedly has been found in breach of Ofcom rules. In other words, there are procedures under the current directive to address the concerns that have been raised. And it's even so that in case of emergency, if we're talking about incitement of hatred, there is a kind of, it is possible to take immediate action while at the same time notifying the European Commission. So we have constantly advocated a formal interregulator approach to the content. And we have repeatedly said that if a regulator wishes to suspend a channel and follows the right procedure set out under the AVMS, we will of course comply with that, no question. But we also welcome the idea of setting up expert committees made up by local and EU experts to assess content, because I realize there are differences when it comes to languages also. A few words finally about the future. As a platform operator, we believe in plurality. Clearly, there is a demand in the Baltic states for Russian language news programming that conforms to European standards in relation to accuracy, impartiality, and objectivity. We therefore welcome all initiatives to establish new Russian-speaking channels, in addition to what TV3 Plus that MTG already offers today. And as you probably understand from my presentation and all the services that we provide, we continuously develop our pay TV offer to respond to what the viewers would want. When it comes to the regulatory framework, certainty and transparency is of utmost importance. As an international broadcaster, offering a wide variety of local and international content, certainty as to the regulatory regime we are subject to is decisive to our current and future business and to our possibilities to offer a diversified content. The prospect of imposing additional layers of national regulation would make compliance much more difficult, both from an administrative and financial perspective. And ultimately, it would risk hurting local audiences as we and for us and others, we might not be able to offer the same variety of channels that we can do under the EU law and the country of origin principle. For the same reason, it is impossible to consider introducing editorial responsibility for platform operators offering third-party channels. If we want to promote plurality, which is a core European value, we need to have a clear and transparent European regulatory framework that is applicable and equal to all member states. Finally, I'm aware that there are different opinions on how the common regulatory framework should look like in the future. We respect that, and we are happy to take part in a discussion about that. But regardless of what different views we may have, it is important, and I hope we agree to that as long as the present directive is in force, we should respect and follow the existing rules and regulations, and not try to impose national legislation that is contrary or in conflict with the AVMS directive. Again, I have the greatest respect for the concerns that have been raised in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. But at the same time, I hope I have been clear that also under the current regulations, there are rules and procedures that can address those concerns, and we will be a constructive partner in those discussions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Henrik. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce or give the floor to Judge Egils Levits.
Thank you very much for this occasion to speak about this important topic before this important public. So I will first explain some reasons and considerations concerning the country of origin principle which were adopted by the directive and on which the authors thought. Secondly, I will touch some problems with this principle, and third, shortly, some concluding remarks. But I will anyway speak very short for giving time for more discussions. The IMS directive provides certain rules for the media services providers. The rules of the directive are in principle very liberal, provider-friendly, in order to achieve two goals. First, not to intervene into the freedom of expression, and second, to establish a common space of information in Europe. Nevertheless, the member states should be able to apply more detailed or more strict rules in the fields coordinated by this directive to media service providers under their jurisdiction, while ensuring that those rules are consistent with general principle of union law. Here we see the system, that the general principles are above and they should be in any way respected, and the directive offers to the countries, to the member states, detailed rules. But the detailed rules should be in order and not to be against the general rules of the treaties. And normally we are speaking on the directive, but we cannot ignore that there is a treaty, the general constitutional treaty of the European Union, which should also be respected. In order to deal with situations where a broadcaster under the jurisdiction of one member state provides a television broadcast which is wholly or mostly directed towards the territory of another member state, a requirement for member states to cooperate with one another, and in cases of circumvention, the codification of the case law of the Court of Justice, combined with a more efficient procedure, accordingly to the authors of this directive, would be an appropriate solution to take account of member states' concerns without calling into question the proper application of the country of origin principle, although cooperation between the regulators of the member states. The concept of rules of general public interest has been developed by the Court of Justice in its case law in relation to previous Articles 43 and 49 of the European Community Treaty, and now to Articles 49 and 56 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, and includes, inter alia, rules of, first, protection of consumers, second, the protection of minors, and third, rules of protection of cultural policy. The member state requesting cooperation should ensure that specific national rules in question are objectively necessary, applied in a non-discriminatory manner, and proportionate. Under this directive, notwithstanding the application of the country of origin principle, member states may still make measures that restrict freedom of movement of television broadcasting, but only under the conditions and following the procedure laid down in this directive, and I will complete also by the treaties, by the general treaties. The Court of Justice has consistently held that any restriction of the freedom to provide services, such as any derogation from a fundamental principle of treaty, must be interpreted restrictively. The country of origin principle should be regarded as the core of the directive, as Andris already said, as it is essential for the creation of an internal market. In the case law of the European Court of Justice, there are not very many cases concerning this directive. And in all cases, the Court of Justice confirmed the country of origin principle. Nevertheless, there were specific cases with economic background. For example, in the case C1195, Commission versus Belgium, the Court of Justice accepted the argument of the Belgian government that the Belgian regulation in question concerned the issue of pluralism, which is not exhaustively regulated by the directive, but also by the treaties. However, the court found in this specific case that there is a violation of the general provision of the treaty. That means this restriction of the Belgian regulation was justified under the directive, but it was not justified under the treaties. That means that the treaty should be regarded as a general framework for this directive. It's interesting also the case Televisiones Comerciales from 2008, in which the Court of Justice reiterated that also a specific rules of a country, in this case Spain, in order to protect the national identity and the cultural diversity in Spain were recognized as justified, and especially this problem of justification of the specific rules in order to protect national culture and cultural diversity is, you can read, is more specifically in the conclusions of Advocate General Kokot in the paragraphs 90 to 102. So now I will come shortly to the problems. So first I will say the country of origin principle is the core principle of the directive, but it should be regarded within the framework of the general treaties. The problems. It would be naive to believe that this principle works absolutely well. We should bear in mind that cultural products concerns autonomy and identity of human beings and can influence the human beings, and therefore these products should be treated, regarded differently, for example, as potatoes, which are interchangeable. But the cultural products are specific products, and this should be also considered. And this is also considered in this case to which I refer in Televisiones Comerciales from 2008. And why it is different from other products? Because it's influenced the people, and in this, by influencing the people, it is possible also to influence the democracy in the member states. The democratic process, it is possible. It is not always the case, but is in principle possible, and this should be regarded also by the interpretation of directive. I think there are three main problems which are also well described in the literature about this directive with regard to the case law of the Court of Justice. One problem is already mentioned here by the colleagues, jurisdiction shopping. Jurisdiction shopping is the behavior of a company which chooses the best member state with the best judicial conditions. And that means, in principle, a competition to below. And such jurisdiction shopping, this is a constant case law of the Court of Justice, should not be possible. Not only in this case, but also in other cases, jurisdiction shopping should be not possible. Then the problem of what was also said here, the efficacy of the supervision and cooperation between national regulatory authorities. We should bear in mind also that there are different capacities of these regulatory offices in different countries, and the procedure is relatively bureaucratic, and what is most important, it's slow. And in specific cases, it comes mostly too late. It is suitable, this procedure, to prohibit, not to allow isolated misuse of the freedom of providing services, but it is not suitable if there is deliberate and massive misuse of this freedom. Because of different reasons, I will not go more deeply into that. In general, the directive, like all rules, are designed for broadcasters or for addressees which are operating in good faith. And therefore, in this kind of framework, it is sufficient. But it's not sufficient in specific cases. And the third kind of problem is political and cultural problem, and the problem of pluralism, which was touched in this one case, Televisiones Comerciales. As I said already, it is possible to influence the process of democracy in one member state if there is such intention to do it. And there was, for example, one case, 2008, between Hungary and Romania, and you know that in Romania there is a big Hungarian minority, and Hungarian broadcasters tried to say that the Hungarian minority should vote for specific one party to circumvent the national provisions on the elections in Romania. Romanian Broadcasting Regulatory Authority asks, by using these rules, the Hungarian authority to do something, but of course it was done 6 months after the elections. And then the pain, maybe 100,000 euros, is not more so important, but you have the result what you wanted to have. I think it would be naive to ignore such threats if it is, so to say, an intentional influence. There is also possible to influence the public opinion by the third country. It was, I think, I was unfortunately not here, but it was already discussed in the first part of this, this conference. Especially if such influence came from a country which is, well, a state which is not fully democratic or not democratic at all, with different values. And you know that the treaties, I remember again, that the treaty is the basis for the interpretation of the directive. And the treaty provides also democratic values. And if there is such kind of influence, that may create a problem. So I will shortly touch two other problems: as cultural diversity and pluralism. The cultural diversity, it was extensively analyzed in the court's case, also in Belgian case, but also in Spanish case. And it was said that the cultural diversity has the same value as economic values or economic interests of the broadcasters. And the court should balance the two interests, the economic interest of the broadcaster on the one side, and the cultural interests or identity interests of the society concerned on the other side. And there is no absolute priority for economic interests. This is a case law of the European Court of Justice. So I will now say some concluding remarks because my time is already over. So I think that the discussion shows, not only here, but also in the scientific academic literature, judicial literature, that this directive has some deficiencies. And it is necessary to develop this directive, and especially this, the country of origin principle. In my view, this is my personal opinion, because there are different opinions, especially you can read maybe the debates in the French parliament about this, where the French parliament, many parliamentarians are asking to abolish this principle at all, because the French culture with 50 million people is endangered, accordingly to some French politicians. But that there is necessity to develop this directive, that is, I think, already more or less clear. In my view, it is not necessary to abolish the principle of country of origin, because it is still needed in order to create a common European informational space, cultural space, also to create common European or to promote common European identity. But it is necessary to define and to develop, to define specific exceptions from this principle. the problem is not the principle as such, in my view, but the problem is that the exceptions are not well defined, well defined by the legislator, European legislator, and the Court of Justice tried in several cases to define that, but it is in the first place the legislator, European legislator, is called to reform the directive, and the court can also has limited possibilities to change the directive as such, but of course if it is like such cases like this cultural diversity case in Spain or on the Belgian case, it is also possible by the court, but the court is only in the second place. So that's the first also for the European legislator to think about and to create just rules for all countries. To conclude, I will remain also on Article 4, Paragraph 3 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. And in this paragraph is said that the member states are called upon are obliged to a sincere cooperation. It could sound, so to say, like nothing. But the Court of Justice is taking exactly this provision very seriously. And if there is not a sincere cooperation between the member states, then of course there is a judgment in which takes conclusions of that. And in the court's case law is also the sincere cooperation is defined by that it includes solidarity. And for example, if a problem in one member state is a problem, but in other member states that is not a problem, that the other member states cannot block to the European legislator to not to deal with that or to block to resolve this problem. For example, for Latvia, it is not a very important problem until now, the problem of refugees, illegal refugees, which is a very important problem in Italy and in Spain and in Greece. But until under the principle of sincere cooperation, accordingly to Article 4, Paragraph 3 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, it would be abuse if Latvia would block the solution in this case. And if in other cases there is some problems of some member states like Baltic states or other, then of course the other member states are also not allowed accordingly to this principle of Article 3, Paragraph 3 of the Treaty of the European Functioning of the European Union to block a solution. Thank you very much for this small overview about that.
Thank you, Egils. We can always rely on you for a brilliant exposition of the constitutional law and European Union law. Just to kick off the discussion, could I outline a small case that is ongoing at this very moment, an example from real life. In 2011, this Swedish NGO IOGT NTO filed a complaint against several TV channels to the Swedish Broadcasting Authority and the Swedish Consumer Agency regarding alcohol marketing on TV, something that, as you know, is prohibited in Sweden. The broadcasters concerned are established in the UK, but broadcast several channels wholly directed to a Swedish audience. At the end of 2012, the Media Authority formally requested Ofcom in the UK for this enhanced cooperation procedure under Article 4.2 in the directive. As a result, Ofcom asked the relevant broadcasters to comply with Swedish law and the ban on alcohol advertising and sponsorship in television broadcasts. The broadcasters replied to Ofcom saying that they do not think that it is appropriate to comply with the request. Now, as I understand it, at the end of last year, the Swedish Broadcasting Authority and the Swedish Consumer Agency have contacted the European Commission in order to get their approval to prohibit alcohol advertising on TV transmitted from other countries, specifically to Sweden. I wonder, Henrik, do you have any comments on this? If the Commission could also comment how far we've got with this, and Ross, maybe you will have a comment on this too.
First of all, they did so, but they have, until further notice, withdrawn the case at the beginning of this year. But I'm sure you can talk to the colleagues from Swedish Broadcasting Agency. But I mean, the key point in this, let me first add one thing that I forgot. You always a little bit nervous when you're to speak, so you tend to forget some points that you had thought of, and that is one thing that is really important in this, because sometimes, at least in a Swedish debate, you get the feeling that as if we are not regulated, but the country of origin principle means that, yes, we are regulated. And in many respects, the rules in the UK are tougher to comply with than Swedish, sort of. So that's just as a general remark to be done. I am not a lawyer, so but as I understand it, the key issue that needs to be proven in a case like this is if the establishment, the broadcasting, and again, we are not broadcasting only to Sweden, but to 40 countries. So the key point is, was the establishment made for the sole purpose to circumvent alcohol advertising rules in Sweden? And that is, in this case, clearly not the case, because when we started, as I shown in '87, the reason was that that was the only country in Europe where you could broadcast via satellite. They were the only one who had the facilities, uplink facilities and technique. And since then, of course, the business has developed. We are broadcasting to more countries, and there is a kind of hub for media. We all know that in London, and you need competence and play-out facilities and so on. It should also be noted that at that time there were no alcohol advertising at all, because there were no market in Sweden, because it was complete monopoly. So we are, of course, first of all, we are regulated, and we have additional rules not to reach young people and so on. So we try to act beyond the legislation in this case, but it's not a circumvention.
Thank you. But are we already allowed to comment on the rest, or only on that? Andris, I'm asking whether I can comment on other things, or I need to wait for that.
You wanted to know what I asked about?
No, I know perfectly what you ask about. You are asking what happens with the Swedish case, and I am asking if you are expecting me to only reply to that, or if I can already comment on other things.
No, I just wanted to know
okay.
what the state of play was with this.
Okay, so the state of play was that indeed there was a communication to us, and that we were discussing with the Swedish authorities, and it's interesting because it's basically the first time that this procedure is being applied. And as the judge mentioned, these rules are drafted in a way that are sometimes quite vague. So what we decided is that for procedural reasons it was better to re-notify if they so wish, of course, to be sure that they come at the right time of the procedure and that the notification is complete, let's say. So that's, it has been a cooperation between the Swedish authorities and the Commission to be sure that the notification is done at the right stage and with all the elements necessary. So, voilà, that's it. And in a way, so I take advantage to comment on, on what the judge was mentioning, because I must say I fully agree that the problem is not the country of origin. The problem are these matters, are that also in accordance with the case law, any exception to the principles of free movement need to be interpreted restrictively, and that if there is harmonization already at EU level on those, this is what applies. And this is what we have in the directive. We have an attempt to harmonize how to apply the exception to a general principle of the EU treaty. And it is true when we are applying it, that there might be a scope to improve these cooperation mechanisms and these exceptions and how they are drafted. This will be, in fact, the challenge of the REFIT exercise to see. It's interesting to see that at the moment we are assessing the directive is when we are having real-life cases of the colleagues of Sweden on alcohol advertising, on the Russian channels as well, and we are basically applying the directive for the first time in many of these fields since the revision.
Yeah, I think Madame said rightly, the problem is exceptions. As exceptions should be defined in a more precise and way which corresponds to the needs, to the new problems. Maybe I can, for that, I can say an example. For example, if there is an exception concerning hate speech, that is clear. But if there would be, for example, in Latvia or in Malta, a channel registered which broadcasts to UK in English to call the people to go to the war for ISIS. It is not a hate speech, accordingly to the broad definition. There is not a hate speech, but simply to go to the war. I think it would be very difficult if it could came to the Court of Justice. We will maybe try to expand the definition of hate speech, but until now there is not such a hate speech. It is possible. So I think the problem is not the hate speech, exception of hate speech, but just below hate speech. Because, as you know, the hate speech as such is not so influential as a little bit below. Because the hate speech is very obvious and you cannot reach very many people. But you can reach with something similar, but not so intense, not so obvious. I think this is a problem which should be also regarded by the definition of the exceptions by the reform of the directive. Thank you.
Okay. Can I? Henrik, yeah.
One comment, it's of course very delicate to draw this line, but I think we should sort of, still I would like to remind that today, when it comes to incitement of hatred or hate speech, there is a possibility to take action under the current regulations, and that was one of my points. Then of course, propaganda, what is that? There I think, as I think Ross pointed out, that in the long run, the most efficient way is to really promote plurality, to make sure that there are other views and that you reach a substantial part of the population with different views and news of accuracy, impartiality, and so on.
Okay, thank you for that. Just a slight diversion here. Could I ask what I think is a pretty tricky legal question? It's one that's cropped up here in Latvia too, and I guess in many member states. When local advertising is inserted into a channel, let's take Fox, for example, a channel that is being transmitted from one jurisdiction to another, and I guess it depends on where this insertion happens. Is this now a different channel, a new channel, and subject to the jurisdiction of the receiving state? Who now has editorial responsibility?
I'm not sure that's a particularly new question, is it? I mean, that one's been around for quite some time, and if I'm right, there's wording in the Council of Europe Convention which allows the receiving state to take action in certain circumstances for advertising aimed at that market, which wasn't picked up in the AVMS. So it seems to me it may be a discussion we've already had. And then as far as I'm concerned, that's a perfectly legitimate business model. You may choose to locate your services for a number of different markets in one territory, and you will then change the feeds around. You're only going to have one play-out centre for a number of markets, and you'll insert the advertising as appropriate. I don't see, I don't see the threat we're trying to prevent there as being in the same scale as what you're faced with at the moment.
I'm not talking about the Russian. I'm talking about, say, Fox is being transmitted into Latvia, but with localized advertising. Theoretically, does this now become a new channel? Because the content has changed.
If they're operating under a license from Member State X, which allows them to broadcast within the European Union, I don't think it's a new channel, no.
I'd now like to open the discussion to the floor. I'll start with Croatia, yes? First, yeah, and then we'll go to the back, then we'll come to the front, and then we'll come to the middle.
My name is Milan. I'm coming from Croatia as a representative of its Ministry of Culture. I would like to pick up the last issue of localized advertising. We have the complaints of commercial televisions in Croatia on the similar grounds. In prime time, there are aggregated audience ratings of these overseas television channels, coming mostly from America, which is strong enough to draw on the local advertising market. These channels, like Fox Crime, for example, with inserted local advertising, is starting more and more to be the competition to local commercial televisions in Croatia. To remind you, these commercial televisions, they operate on certain rules set out by the directive we are talking about. They have certain quotes of European content. They took on certain obligations to produce local programming, while they suffer from overseas competition, not obliged to comply to any sort of rules, to any sort of spending and investment into local production, where all right, the advertising income of the local commercial television is one victim, but the other victim may be also cultural and linguistic diversity. Just to remind you that Treaty of European Union stands for, of course, the internal market, but it also stresses very clearly that one of the key aims of the European Union is promotion of its cultural and linguistic diversity. So the question is, how can we expect to preserve that sort of cultural diversity if the funding, which comes in this case from advertising, funding of production in these rich and diverse languages will be drawn overseas in this example? Thank you.
Okay, there was a question from the back.
Thank you. So, sorry.
Okay.
Is it
From the back.
Is it open? Oh, sorry. Yes, again, Danish Film Institute, the European Directors Network. I would like to draw the attention to a different matter regarding the country of origin principle, but it's also connected to the freedom of speech, because when we talk about the audiovisual economy in Europe, we are facing 3 billion euros going out to the support of European content in the different member states. And we are facing over-the-top services saying that maybe they are referring, and maybe it's not that strict yet, but at least they're trying to, referring to the country of origin principle, saying that you cannot put our engagement into European content. You cannot say that we have to comply with the rules in France, in Germany, in Italy, or in Denmark, according to the country of origin. So they're saying if we are situated, for example, in Holland or in Luxembourg, we shall not comply with the rules in Germany, Spain, or what other countries when it comes to the financing of European content. And you can say the challenge here is that if we do not have these new operators engaged in the audiovisual sector like European operators are, then there might be a risk that we might lose the whole aspect of it. We do not have any content to provide each other. And I think this is also a very big challenge when we look into the country of origin principle. I'm not saying that we should change the country of origin principle in order to solve this problem, but it's a part of the discussion in this. And I want you also to comment on that. Thank you very much.
Andris from the Latvian Audiovisual Media Services Regulatory Authority. I would like to underline that incitement to hatred is very serious.
Andris, can you say who you are and who you represent?
I said. I can. Yeah, National Electronic Mass Media Council. This is official title. So I would like to underline that violation of directive is a case of incitement to hatred on grounds or because of nationality is very serious. And do we really believe, when we speak concrete about so-called Russian federal channels, which are registered in other member states, not in the Baltic states, that during that war, already 1 year is going on between Russia and Ukraine, there was no case when such incitement to hatred in these channels, in these member states where these channels are in the jurisdiction was stated. Do we really believe that these channels are working according to the goals of directive? I not believe. And we have serious evidences that there are not real effective monitoring. In the countries like UK, Sweden, because they don't understand the language, they started actually only with Russia Today because this is in English. But all other federal channels are registered and are in jurisdiction of these member states. So, what we need more effective monitoring, and our proposal is to have these channels registered here, where they are participating in advertising market, even for sausages in Rimi supermarket, and such advertising. So they must be registered here to have this effective monitoring. This is our proposal. I would like to hear your response to this.
Well, first of all, again, I fully understand and respect the views that we often hear here in the Baltic states. But as what I tried to say in my contribution, that there is a clear procedure. You can, calling for that it is incitement of hatred, at the same time notify the Commission. And you can switch channels off, equal for all distributors. And then the Commission will sort of assess this. And what we have communicated, if this procedure is followed, we will of course comply with that. Then of course, I fully understand and that there might be problems of language, and that's why I also said in my contribution here that we are open to find better ways of cooperation between national regulators, that we could involve EU and national experts. So, and we are very happy to take part in a very constructive dialogue and how to continue that work. But I think it has been quite clear, and I really welcome that in the panel as well, that sort of we seem to agree that the country of origin principle is the right way to go forward. And then there might be some problems, but then we need to improve cooperation, because we cannot, and we need clear and transparent rules, because we can't end up in sometimes joke that I have my principles, and if they don't fit, I have others. We shouldn't end up with that situation. We need clear, transparent rules and how to deal with these very delicate issues that are brought up.
Thank you. Well, Henrik, I think you will be pleased to hear that in a week or so, the Baltic regulators plus Ofcom plus the Swedish Broadcasting Authority are meeting in Vilnius to talk exactly about this. Now,
we are, of course, have a very active dialogue with the regulators in the Baltic states, and increasingly constructive and good. So we think that is important.
okay, we have 2 minutes left till coffee break, so I can take maximum 2 at the risk of you throwing tomatoes at me. I see Ofcom at the back, and then EBU, yeah?
Well, it's actually not Ofcom, but Katharina Ribbe from DCMS, that's the Department for Culture, Media and Sports in London. I'd like to start our comments with assuring you that we are really sympathetic to the situation in the Baltic states, and we are trying to follow it with very serious interest and offer a couple of solutions. But following this debate, I need to remark that I think there are a lot of misunderstandings in the room about how a procedure works and how decisions would be taken. So, for example, there was this the question on whether people should, or whether member states should speak up if they think a solution is good or bad. I think member states, however, if they're not concerned, should speak up and say it's a bad solution. And to AVMS, I think we have to do a very careful analysis where the problem in the Baltic states stems from. And then in a second step, we have to ask, can we solve it in AVMS, or do we need to solve it elsewhere? And I think to a majority of the problems which have been raised, the answer might not be an IVMS. Otherwise, we are very, very open for any kind of consultation and discussion, and also for solving immediate problems. But changing law should be substantive and also sustainable, and that's how we hope the new AVMS will look like. Thank you.
EBU.
Yeah, I think I will surprise nobody if I say Michael Wagner from the European Broadcasting Union, that of course our members also see the kind of origin principle as a cornerstone of the directive, but we are open also to discuss exceptions. I think we had a very interesting debate today. There is one aspect I wonder, but it may not need a bit more attention, that is the question of what areas are coordinated by the directive. Because I heard the question about support for audiovisual productions, and there are member states that have kind of parafiscal charges or levies to support film production funds, etc. And I would assume that this is outside the scope of the directive, so we don't need to discuss exception in that case. But also in other cases, I mean, national security, impartiality, there's something in the convention, but not really in the directive or other aspects. But I think that's one aspect to consider as well. Is something harmonized, and how far harmonization goes in the directive? Thank you.
Excellent. Any last comments from the panel?
I think there are 2 points that weren't picked up, so I'll give a go to them. I think, firstly, the gentleman asked about monitoring, whether there was effective monitoring at member state level. I think these days we have 11,000 TV channels and 3,000 on-demand services in Europe. I think it is unrealistic to expect a regulator to sit and watch every single minute of content and you know, tick a box whether an advertising break was compliant or not. I think we're moving to a system where it has to be complaint driven, and obviously if a complaint comes in, I think Estonian was the example we used this morning, to a local regulator, then they will have to hire somebody to help them with that. But I think it has to be now sort of on a complaints driven basis, which will help the monitoring. I think the question about local advertising opt-outs from Croatia, I think it was. I mean, we've been around this for quite a long time in the directive, and I think fundamentally there's a question that after a certain time you have to say, well, we either have an internal market or we don't. And if you have an internal market, you can base yourself in one part of the European Union and broadcast into the other one with the appropriate advertising. And if that's not what the Commission wants operators to do, then we need a clear signal from them. Maybe it's from higher up, from Vice President Ansip or somebody. But there's a feeling sometimes in these conversations that the European audiovisual market is a little bit pregnant. We're trying to be one thing and then something else. And as we see it, we have an internal market that gives you the right to broadcast into another territory with certain conditions. I think my final comment, I think the most interesting suggestion was from the judge just at the end of his interventions when he spoke about the need to define further what is meant by hate speech. I think that's probably the crux of the matter, that you're now faced with content that is probably as offensive to you as incitement to hatred would be. Not to you personally, but to you as a society, as a country, but which isn't caught by the directive. I mean, when the directive was drawn up between 12 Western European countries in the mid-1980s, and no one could have envisaged this situation. So, but there will be resources out there, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, there are a lot of people who have done a lot of good thinking about hate speech, media pluralism, and so on. And I think if we start that work now, you will get a satisfactory resolution quicker than if we wait for the directive to be revised.
Yes, lovely. It remains for me to thank our speakers, Henrik, Egils and Ross, and as usual, no speaker goes away empty-handed. No speaker goes away empty-handed. Stay there for a minute. And before you rush off, let me remind you that after the coffee break, we have the working groups. Working Group 1 is in room 122, all on this floor. Working Group 2 is in the Jura Hall, and the Working Group 3 stays here. For tonight, let me remind you, we have an informal evening planned for you at the Ala Folk Club. Ala means cave in Latvian. Please remember to take your badges with you, because there will be security obviously on the door, and the badges will guarantee you entrance. So, I think that's all I have to say for now. Coffee break, and then please reconvene at 4:30. And if I don't see you earlier, see you in the cave.